December 7th, 1941. The Pacific erupts in flame. Hundreds of Japanese planes roar across the sky, engines screaming over sleeping sailors. Within minutes, battleships burn, men die, and history changes forever. But far away, in a quiet command post, one man listens to the news in silence. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of this attack, does not celebrate. Because he knows what others do not. This is not victory. This is the beginning of Japan's end. The story you're about to hear is not one of heroes and villains. It is the story of a man trapped between brilliance and duty, between foresight and loyalty. It is the tragedy of a genius who created the very event that would destroy everything he loved. This is the story of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto and the war he never wanted to fight. In the spring of 1884, in the mountain town of Nagaoka, a boy was born into a world being torn apart and rebuilt. His father, Sadayoshi Takano, was a samurai. But this was no longer the age of samurai. A Meiji restoration had shattered the old order. The swords were being replaced by rifles. The feudal domains were giving way to a modern nation. Japan was racing to catch up with the West, terrified of being colonized by China, desperate to prove itself equal to the European powers. The boy was named Isoroku, meaning 56, after his father's age at his birth. It was an unusual name, a practical name, the mark of a family that had survived centuries by adapting to change. Young Isoroku grew up in the shadow of this transformation. His father, too old for the new world, passed away when the boy was just 9 years old. His older siblings raised him with discipline and expectation. There was no room for weakness in a family of former samurai trying to maintain honor in a changing empire. The boy was small, quiet, and intensely curious. He excelled at mathematics. He read voraciously, and like many boys of his generation, he looked toward the sea. Japan was an island nation. Its future, everyone knew, would be determined by naval power. At 16, Isoroku sat for the entrance examination to the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy. He placed 7th out of 300 candidates. It was the beginning of a remarkable career. The academy at Etajima was modeled after the British Royal Navy's Dartmouth. It was brutal, disciplined, hierarchical. Young cadets were pushed to their limits, taught navigation, gunnery, tactics, and the warrior code of Bushido adapted for modern warfare. But Isoroku thrived. He wasn't the strongest or the tallest, but he was among the brightest. His mind worked differently. Where others memorized, he understood. Where others followed orders, he questioned strategies. In 1904, his world exploded into war. Russia and Japan clashed over control of Manchuria and Korea. It was a war that would shock the world, the first time an Asian power defeated a European empire in modern times, and young ensign Isoroku Takano found himself at the center of history. May 27th, 1905, the Battle of Tsushima Strait. The Russian Baltic Fleet, having sailed halfway around the world, met the Japanese Navy in the waters between Korea and Japan. It was one of the most decisive naval battles in history. Admiral Togo Heihachiro, commanding the Japanese fleet with brilliant tactics, destroyed nearly the entire Russian force in less than 2 days. Isoroku served aboard the cruiser Nissan. In the chaos of battle, a shell exploded near his station. Shrapnel tore through his left hand and leg. 2 fingers were lost. Blood soaked the deck. Men screamed around him. But the young ensign survived, scarred, but alive. He would carry those scars for the rest of his life, a permanent reminder of what war truly meant. Not glory, not honor, pain, loss. the smell of burning flesh and the sound of dying men. After the war, as he recovered, Isoroku Takano was adopted into the Yamamoto family, a common practice in Japan to preserve family lines. He took their name. From that point forward, he was Yamamoto Isoroku. The young officer returned to his studies with renewed intensity. He wasn't interested in the bravado of the warrior culture that dominated the Navy. He was interested in truth, in mathematics, in the cold logic of what wins wars. And increasingly, he became fascinated by a new technology that most officers dismissed as a novelty: the airplane. In 1919, 35-year-old Commander Yamamoto received orders that would change his life. He was being sent to the United States to study at Harvard and serve as a naval attaché in Washington. For many Japanese officers, this would have been a punishment, an exile to the land of the potential enemy. But for Yamamoto, it was an awakening. He arrived in America just after the First World War. The country was buzzing with energy, confidence, and unprecedented industrial might. Yamamoto walked through the streets of Boston and Washington with his eyes wide open, observing everything. He enrolled at Harvard, studying English and petroleum economics. Oil, he realized, was the bloodline of modern warfare. Ships, planes, tanks, all of them were useless without fuel, and Japan had almost none. He spent hours in Harvard Yard, drinking coffee, reading American newspapers, watching students debate freely about politics and ideas. The openness fascinated him. In Japan, such freedom was unthinkable. Here, young men and women questioned everything, challenged authority, spoke their minds without fear. Yamamoto traveled extensively. He visited factories in Detroit, watched automobiles roll off assembly lines with mechanical precision. He toured steel mills in Pittsburgh, witnessed the raw industrial capacity that dwarfed anything in Japan. He went to oil refineries in Texas, saw the endless pumping of black gold that powered American civilization. And slowly, a terrifying realization formed in his mind. Japan could never win a war against the United States. It wasn't a matter of courage or fighting spirit. It was simple mathematics. America's industrial capacity was 10 times, 20 times, perhaps 30 times greater than Japan's. Its oil reserves were vast, its population was larger, its technology was advancing at an incredible pace. But it wasn't just the numbers that impressed Yamamoto. It was the American character itself. He made friends with American naval officers. He found them pragmatic, innovative, unbound by rigid tradition. They thought in terms of efficiency and results, not honor and ritual. He learned to play poker and bridge, spending long evenings at officers' clubs studying the psychology of his opponents. In cards, he found a mirror of naval strategy, the importance of calculating odds, managing risk, reading the intentions hidden behind neutral faces, and knowing when to fold. One night, playing bridge with American officers, one of them joked, "You Japanese are good students, but you'll never beat us at innovation." Yamamoto smiled politely and said nothing. But the comment stayed with him. Was it true? Was Japan doomed to always be catching up, always imitating, never leading? During his time in America, he also developed a deep appreciation for jazz music. He would sit in smoky clubs listening to the improvisational genius of American musicians. There was something in jazz that spoke to him, the balance between structure and freedom, the way a melody could be both disciplined and spontaneous. In 1921, Yamamoto returned to Japan and was immediately sent back to Washington as the Japanese naval attaché. He spent 2 more years in America, this time with even greater access to military and industrial facilities. He attended the Washington Naval Conference of 1921 to 1922, where the great powers negotiated limits on naval armaments. Japan was forced to accept a smaller fleet than Britain or America, a ratio of 5 to 5 to 3. Many Japanese officers saw this as humiliation. Yamamoto saw it as realism. Japan simply couldn't compete in a battleship arms race. But more importantly, he became convinced that battleships themselves were becoming obsolete. The future, he believed, belonged to aircraft carriers and naval aviation. When Yamamoto returned to Japan in 1923, he was a changed man. He had seen the future, and it filled him with both wonder and dread.
The Japan that Yamamoto returned to was spiraling toward darkness. The 1920s saw increasing political instability. The Great Depression devastated the Japanese economy. Unemployment soared, social unrest grew, and into this chaos stepped the militarists, a faction of army and navy officers who believed Japan's destiny was to dominate Asia, to create a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere under Japanese rule. Yamamoto watched with growing alarm as these officers gained influence. Many were young, fanatical, products of an education system that taught absolute loyalty to the emperor and contempt for Western values. They assassinated politicians who opposed military expansion. They pressured the government into aggressive foreign policies. In 1931, the Japanese army manufactured an incident in Manchuria and used it as a pretext to invade. The League of Nations condemned Japan. Japan withdrew from the League. The militarists declared this a victory against Western imperialism. Yamamoto, now a rear admiral and increasingly influential in the Navy, spoke out against the madness. In private meetings, he argued passionately that Japan was making a terrible mistake, that antagonizing the Western powers would lead to disaster. But he was swimming against a tide of nationalism. His time in America had made him suspect in the eyes of the ultranationalists. They whispered that he had been corrupted by Western thinking, that he had lost his Japanese spirit. Some called him a traitor. There were threats against his life. In 1933, Yamamoto was appointed head of the Aeronautics Department of the Navy Ministry. It was both a promotion and a kind of exile. The conservatives wanted him out of the way, focused on something they still considered peripheral: aviation. They had no idea what they had done. Yamamoto threw himself into building Japan's naval air force with the same intensity he brought to everything. He understood what the traditionalists did not. The age of the battleship was ending. The future of naval warfare would be decided by airplanes and aircraft carriers. He pushed for the development of advanced fighters and bombers. He demanded better pilot training. He personally visited air bases, spoke with pilots, studied their reports. He wasn't a distant administrator. He wanted to understand every detail of this new form of warfare. Under his leadership, Japan developed some of the finest naval aircraft in the world, including the Zero fighter, which would dominate the skies in the early years of the Pacific War. But even as he built this formidable weapon, Yamamoto never stopped warning against war with America. In 1939, Yamamoto was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, the highest operational command in the Japanese Navy. He was 55 years old, at the peak of his career, commanding the most powerful naval force Japan had ever assembled. And he was terrified. Europe had erupted into war. Hitler's Germany was conquering nation after nation. In Japan, the militarists saw an opportunity. With the European powers distracted, Japan could seize their colonies in Southeast Asia, particularly the oil-rich Dutch Indies East. There was just one problem: the United States. America was watching Japan's aggression with increasing alarm. Economic sanctions began. First steel, then scrap metal, then oil. By 1941, Japan was being strangled. Without oil, the Japanese military would grind to a halt within months. The militarists faced a choice: back down and abandon their imperial ambitions, or seize the resources they needed by force.
They chose force. Yamamoto was called to meetings in Tokyo. The question was put to him directly. Could Japan defeat the United States in a war? His answer was unequivocal. No. He laid out the mathematics. America's industrial capacity, its oil reserves, its population, its technological innovation, everything favored the United States in a prolonged conflict. Japan might win initial victories, but ultimately, the giant would awaken and crush them. He was asked, what if Japan struck first, dealt a devastating blow that crippled the American Pacific Fleet? Yamamoto thought carefully before answering. He knew what they wanted to hear. He also knew that if war was inevitable, Japan's only chance was a rapid, decisive campaign that would force America to negotiate peace before its full power could be mobilized. Finally, he spoke words that would haunt him forever. If I am told to fight, regardless of the consequences, I shall run wild for the first 6 months or a year, but I have utterly no confidence for the second or third year. It was both a promise and a warning. He would do his duty. He would fight brilliantly, but he could not deliver victory. The militarists heard only the first part, run wild for 6 months. They thought it would be enough. Yamamoto knew better. Summer and fall of 1941. Yamamoto locked himself away planning the impossible. If Japan was going to attack the United States, it needed to be a blow so devastating that the American Pacific Fleet would be crippled for months, perhaps a year. This would buy Japan time to seize Southeast Asia's resources and build a defensive perimeter that would be too costly for America to break. The target was obvious: Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy's main base in the Pacific. But attacking Pearl Harbor was considered nearly impossible. It was thousands of miles from Japan, heavily defended, and shallow water made torpedo attacks impractical. Most naval strategists thought it was too risky. Yamamoto thought it was essential. He studied everything: weather patterns, American patrol schedules, torpedo technology, carrier operations. He worked with his staff refining every detail. They developed special torpedoes that can run in shallow water. They planned the attack route to avoid detection. They trained pilots relentlessly. The plan was audacious. 6 aircraft carriers would sail across the North Pacific in complete radio silence. On a Sunday morning, when American defenses were at their most relaxed, waves of bombers and torpedo planes would strike Pearl Harbor from multiple directions, overwhelming the defenders before they could react. But even as he perfected the plan, Yamamoto felt a growing sense of doom. He confided in his closest aides. He wrote letters that revealed his despair. In one, he wrote, "A military man can scarcely pride himself on having smitten a sleeping enemy. It is more a matter of shame, simply, for the one smitten. I would rather you made your appraisal after you see what the enemy does, since it is certain that, angered and outraged, he will soon launch a determined counterattack." He knew exactly what would happen. The attack would succeed, and it would doom Japan. In the fall, negotiations between Japan and the United States collapsed. The American oil embargo remained in place. Japan's reserves were draining. The decision was made: war. Yamamoto issued his orders. The carrier strike force, under Admiral Nagumo, departed in late November, sailing into the gray waters of the North Pacific. And Yamamoto waited, thousands of miles away, knowing that he had just set history on an irreversible course.
December 7th, 1941. Sunday morning in Hawaii. The sea is calm. The sky is clear. At Pearl Harbor, the battleships of the Pacific Fleet rest at anchor, massive steel monuments to American naval power. The USS Arizona, the USS Oklahoma, the USS California, the USS West Virginia, the USS Nevada, the USS Maryland, the USS Tennessee, the USS Pennsylvania, all in neat rows, gleaming in the morning sun. On shore, sailors sleep late. It's a weekend. Some are at breakfast. Others are writing letters home. A few are attending church services. At 7:48 a.m., the first wave of Japanese planes appears. They come from the north, 183 aircraft diving out of the sun. Torpedo bombers scream across the water, their weapons slung low. Dive bombers plunge from altitude, sirens wailing. Fighters strafe the airfields, destroying American planes before they can take off. The first torpedoes strike the battleships. Massive explosions tear through steel hulls. The USS Oklahoma is hit by 4 torpedoes in rapid succession. She begins to roll over, trapping hundreds of men inside. The USS California takes 2 torpedoes and starts to sink. The USS West Virginia is hit by 6 torpedoes and settles to the bottom, her crew fighting desperately to escape. Then comes the USS Arizona. At 8:06 a.m., a 1,760-pound armor-piercing bomb dropped from 10,000 feet penetrates the deck and detonates in the forward ammunition magazine. The explosion is catastrophic. The ship's forward section erupts in a fireball that rises hundreds of feet into the air. More than 1,100 men die in seconds. The second wave arrives at 8:50 a.m. More bombs, more torpedoes, more destruction. By the time the attack ends, just before 10 a.m., 8 battleships have been sunk or damaged, more than 180 aircraft destroyed, 2,403 Americans dead, 1,178 wounded. The Japanese lose 29 aircraft and fewer than 65 men. By any military standard, it is a stunning victory. Thousands of miles away, Yamamoto receives the news. The attack has exceeded all expectations. The American battleship force has been devastated. The Pacific is now a Japanese lake. His staff is jubilant. Officers are celebrating. Champagne is opened. Toasts are made to the brilliance of their commander, the genius who has delivered this victory. Yamamoto sits alone, silent. One of his aides approaches, excited, congratulating him on the success. Yamamoto looks up, his face hollow, and speaks softly. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." The aide doesn't understand. They have won. Japan is triumphant. But Yamamoto knows better. He knows exactly what will happen now. He knows that in the rubble of Pearl Harbor, in the faces of American sailors pulling their dead shipmates from the water, in the shock and rage spreading across the United States at this moment, something terrible is being born. America, until now uncertain about entering the war, divided about intervention, will now unite with a fury that Japan cannot comprehend. The military-industrial complex that Yamamoto saw in Detroit and Pittsburgh, the vast resources he witnessed in Texas, the innovative spirit he encountered at Harvard, all of it will now be turned towards a single purpose: the destruction of Japan. And there is nothing he can do to stop it. He had warned them. He had told them this would happen. He had laid out the mathematics, the logic, the inevitable conclusion. But duty demanded he create the very catastrophe he foresaw. That is the burden of genius in the service of folly, to see clearly what others cannot, and to be powerless to prevent it. The months after Pearl Harbor unfolded exactly as Yamamoto predicted. Japan ran wild. The Philippines fell. Malaysia fell. Singapore, the great British fortress in Asia, fell. Burma fell. The Dutch East Indies fell. Across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, the rising sun flag rose over captured territories. Yamamoto's carrier strike force rampaged through the Pacific and Indian Oceans. They raided Ceylon, they threatened Australia. The Japanese Navy seemed invincible. But even in victory, Yamamoto saw the shadows lengthening. American industrial production was accelerating. New ships were being launched at an impossible rate. New aircraft were rolling off assembly lines by the thousands. The sleeping giant was not just awake, it was enraged. And there was another problem. Pearl Harbor had been a tactical success, but a strategic failure. The attack had missed the most important targets, the American aircraft carriers. The USS Enterprise, the USS Lexington, and the USS Saratoga were all at sea during the attack. They survived. Yamamoto knew that the next confrontation would be decided by carriers, not battleships. He also knew that time was running out. The 6 months he had promised were almost over. In May 1942, Japanese and American carriers clashed in the Coral Sea. It was the first naval battle in history where the opposing ships never came within sight of each other. Everything was decided by aircraft. The battle was tactically indecisive, but strategically it was Japan's first setback. One Japanese carrier was sunk, another damaged. More importantly, Japan's advance toward Australia was halted. Yamamoto decided on a bold stroke. He would lure the American carriers into a decisive battle and destroy them. The target would be Midway Island, a strategic outpost in the Central Pacific. It was June 1942, exactly 6 months since Pearl Harbor. The Battle of Midway began on June 4, 1942. Yamamoto committed his entire fleet, 4 large carriers, 2 light carriers, 11 battleships, 16 cruisers, and 46 destroyers. It was the most powerful naval force Japan had ever assembled for a single operation. But what Yamamoto didn't know was that American codebreakers had cracked the Japanese naval codes. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, knew exactly where Yamamoto was going and when he would arrive. The Americans set a trap. 3 American carriers, the Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, were waiting north of Midway. The battle was chaotic, brutal, and decisive. Japanese aircraft struck Midway Island, causing significant damage, but when they returned to their carriers to rearm and refuel, American dive bombers appeared. In the span of 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were set ablaze. A 4th, the Hiryu, was destroyed later that day. 4 of Japan's 6 large carriers, the veterans of Pearl Harbor, were gone. Yamamoto had no choice but to retreat. It was the first major defeat of the Japanese Navy in modern times. And it happened exactly when Yamamoto said it would, at the 6-month mark. The prophecy had fulfilled itself. After Midway, Yamamoto knew the war was lost. Japan would continue fighting. There would be more battles, more victories even. But the tide had turned. America's industrial might was overwhelming. Every month, new ships, new aircraft, new weapons appeared in greater numbers. Japan, meanwhile, was being bled dry. Yamamoto continued his duties. He planned operations. He visited his fleet. He maintained the discipline and morale of his men. But those who knew him well saw the change. The energy was gone. The spark had dimmed. He had become a man going through the motions, executing a role he no longer believed in. He wrote letters to friends that revealed his despair. He knew Japan's leaders would never surrender, even in the face of certain defeat. The warrior culture, the code of Bushido, the concept of honor, all of it meant that Japan would fight until it was completely destroyed. He had helped set this machine in motion, and now he could only watch as it ground his nation into dust. In early 1943, Yamamoto planned a tour of forward bases in the Solomon Islands.
April 18, 1943. The message reaches Admiral Nimitz's headquarters in Hawaii. Yamamoto's flight plan is laid out in detail. Departure time, route, destination, even the type of aircraft he'll be flying. The Americans face a decision. This is an opportunity to kill the architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who had humiliated the U.S. Navy. But it's also a risk. If they act on the intelligence, the Japanese will know their codes are compromised. The decision goes all the way to President Roosevelt. His answer is unequivocal: get Yamamoto. On Guadalcanal, 18 P-38 Lightning fighters are prepared for a special mission. They're given the exact time and location of Yamamoto's flight. The math is calculated precisely. They'll have just enough fuel to reach the intercept point and return. The mission is codenamed Operation Vengeance. Morning, April 18, 1943. Bougainville Island. Yamamoto boards a Mitsubishi G4M bomber, a twin-engine aircraft the Americans call the Betty. It's fast, but lightly armored. His staff begs him to postpone, to take a different route, but Yamamoto dismisses their concerns. Perhaps part of him knows. Perhaps after years of living with the burden of foresight, some part of him welcomes what's coming. The bomber takes off, accompanied by 60 fighters as escorts. They fly low over the jungle, following the coastline. At 9:34 a.m., the American P-38s appear. The Japanese Zeros react immediately, diving to intercept. A vicious dogfight erupts in the sky above the jungle. But 4 P-38s break through the screen, diving toward the bombers. Lieutenant Rex Barber closes on Yamamoto's plane. His guns hammer. Tracer rounds stream across the sky. The G4M is hit. Its right engine explodes into flame. The aircraft shudders, losing altitude. Yamamoto sits in the cabin, his katana across his lap, as the plane spirals downward. In these final seconds, what does he think? Does he feel relief? Does he mourn for Japan? Does he think of all the warnings he gave that were ignored? The bomber crashes into the jungle at full speed. The impact is catastrophic. The next day, Japanese search parties find the wreckage. They find Yamamoto still strapped in his seat, his hand gripping his katana. He's sitting upright, almost at attention, facing forward. 2 bullets had passed through him. Death had been instant. He was 59 years old. When news of Yamamoto's death reaches Tokyo, the nation goes into mourning. The emperor personally orders a state funeral. Yamamoto is given posthumous promotion to fleet admiral, the highest rank in the Navy. But the truth is carefully hidden. The Japanese people are not told that their greatest admiral was ambushed, that he was killed by enemy fighters, that the Americans had broken their codes. Instead, they're told he died in combat, a vague phrase that suggests a heroic end. The myth is more important than the truth. For the Americans, Yamamoto's death is celebrated as revenge for Pearl Harbor. Newspapers run triumphant headlines. It's a propaganda victory as much as a military one. But some American officers who had known Yamamoto in the 1920s, the men who played poker with him, who debated with him, who respected his intellect, these men feel a different emotion. They know they've killed one of the few Japanese leaders who truly understood America, who had warned against this war, who might have been an advocate for peace if anyone had listened to him. In killing Yamamoto, America has removed a voice of reason from an increasingly fanatical Japanese leadership. The war grinds on for 2 more years after Yamamoto's death. Japan fights with desperate courage and increasing futility. Island after island falls to American forces. The Japanese Navy is decimated. The Air Force is destroyed. Cities are firebombed. Millions die. And through it all, Yamamoto's prophecy echoes. I shall run wild for 6 months, but I have utterly no confidence for the 2nd or 3rd year. 6 months. Midway happened at 6 months. The turning point came exactly when he said it would. In August 1945, atomic bombs fall on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Soviet Union invades Manchuria. Finally, on August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announces Japan's surrender. The war that Yamamoto never wanted, the war he warned against, the war he helped begin, is over. Japan lies in ruins. Millions are dead, the empire is gone, the nation that sought to dominate Asia is occupied by American forces. Everything Yamamoto foresaw has come to pass. Today, more than 80 years later, we remember Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku. In Japan, he's revered as a brilliant strategist, a man of honor who did his duty despite personal doubts. His grave receives visitors daily. His story is taught in schools as an example of loyalty and sacrifice. In America, he's remembered as the architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who brought war to a nation that wanted peace. But historians also recognize his warnings, his opposition to the war, and the tragic irony of his position. The truth is more complex than either narrative. Yamamoto was a man caught between 2 worlds, 2 cultures, 2 ways of thinking. He loved his country but understood his enemy better than his own leaders did. He was a modern man in a nation intoxicated by ancient myths of honor and destiny. He had the intellect to see the future but lacked the power to change it. His story raises profound questions that extend far beyond World War II. What is the duty of the intelligent person in service to a foolish cause? When you see disaster approaching, when you warn those in power and they refuse to listen, what do? Do you resign in protest? Do you sabotage from within? Or do you do your duty, execute your orders brilliantly, and watch the catastrophe unfold? Yamamoto chose duty. He stayed. He planned Pearl Harbor. He fought as brilliantly as he promised, and he lived just long enough to see his worst fears realized. Was it the right choice? History doesn't answer that question. It only records the consequences. There's a Japanese concept called mono no aware, the pathos of things, a sensitivity to the transience of life and the sadness of inevitable change. It's often associated with cherry blossoms, beautiful precisely because they bloom briefly and fall. Yamamoto's life embodies this concept. His brilliance bloomed in service to a cause that was already doomed. He created a masterpiece of military planning that destroyed the nation he loved. He ran wild for 6 months just as he promised, and then watched as the prophecy he'd spoken consumed everything. Perhaps that's the truest measure of genius. Not the ability to create victory, but the courage to see defeat coming and walk toward it anyway, bound by duty, honor, and the code of a samurai who lived in the age of aircraft carriers. There's a photograph of Yamamoto taken in the 1930s. He's standing on the deck of a battleship, looking out at the Pacific Ocean. His face is thoughtful, almost sad. His eyes seem to be gazing at something far beyond the horizon. What was he seeing in that moment? Was it the war to come? Was it the flaming ships of Pearl Harbor? Was it his own death in the jungle? Or was it something even further ahead? A future where his warnings might finally be understood? We'll never know. But the Pacific he's gazing at in that photograph is the same Pacific we see today. The waves roll the same way. The wind blows the same way.
The water reflects the sky in the same shades of blue and gray. The ocean remains. The ships are gone. The men are gone. The empire is gone. Only the lesson remains. And that lesson is this: foresight without the power to act is the cruelest gift. To know what's coming, to speak the truth, to be ignored, and then to be forced by duty and honor to bring about the very catastrophe you predicted, that is a tragedy beyond measure.
Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku built a masterpiece of war, knowing it would destroy him and everything he loved. And perhaps, in the end, that knowledge was his real enemy, more deadly than any bomb or bullet. He died as he lived, loyal to a nation that wouldn't listen, brilliant in service to a cause he knew was doomed, a genius trapped in inevitability. The sleeping giant awoke, and Yamamoto, who had tried so desperately to prevent it, became the man who ensured it. That is the irony. That is the tragedy. That is the story of the man who foresaw his nation's end and created it with his own hands. The Pacific is calm today, but if you listen carefully, in the wind and waves, you might still hear the distant echo of his prophecy. I shall run wild for 6 months, but I have utterly no confidence for the 2nd or 3rd year. He kept his promise, both parts, and in doing so, he became immortal, not for his victories, but for being right about defeat. That is the burden of the prophet. That is the curse of the genius. To see the end and walk toward it anyway.